A surgeon found and operated on an injured child on the street. When he got home and turned on the television, he was shocked to see the photo of the child on the news. The night was heavy with rain, and the rhythmic sound of droplets hitting the windshield was the only company the surgeon had as he drove down the empty street. His mind wandered to the long hours he had spent in the operating room, the countless lives he had saved, and the exhaustion weighing down his body. But just as his thoughts began to blur, his headlights caught something on the sidewalk, a small, unmoving figure. Instinctively, his foot slammed on the brakes. His heart raced as he squinted through the rain, realizing it was a child, lying still, drenched and wounded. Without a second thought, he jumped out of the car, his feet splashing into puddles as he hurried to the child's side. The boy was unconscious, his body battered and bruised in ways that sent a chill down the surgeon's spine. Years of medical training kicked in, and without wasting a second, he assessed the boy's condition. The injuries were severe. Time was running out. His car was closer than an ambulance would be. In that split second, the decision was made. Gently but swiftly, he lifted the boy, feeling the frail weight of a life hanging by a thread in his arms. Back in the car, his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. The boy lay slumped in the passenger seat, his shallow breaths barely audible over the pounding rain. The surgeon's mind raced through medical protocols, trying to calculate the best course of action, but his emotions pulled him in another direction. He wasn't just a doctor tonight. He felt a strange responsibility, a deep connection to this child. Every red light felt like a cruel obstacle in the fight for the boy's life, the road stretching endlessly before them. The hospital finally came into view, its bright lights cutting through the dark, stormy night. Relief surged through him, but he knew this was just the beginning. Screeching to a stop, he rushed into the emergency room, shouting for help before the doors even closed behind him. The medical team, startled by his urgency, jumped into action. The surgeon's usual calm, methodical demeanor was gone, replaced by a frantic energy. This boy wasn't just another patient. Something about him felt different. He couldn't explain it, but the weight of the night pressed heavily on him. Inside the operating room, time seemed to blur. The surgeon's hands moved with precision, his mind laser-focused on the task at hand, but a nagging feeling gnawed at him. The boy's injuries told a story, a violent one. His small frame was covered in cuts and bruises, each one more alarming than the last. The surgeon had seen cases like this before, but never with such a personal stake. His mind kept drifting back to the moment he found the boy, the stillness of his body on the wet pavement, and the questions he couldn't yet answer. As the hours passed, the tension in the room thickened. The beeping of machines filled the air, a constant reminder of the boy's fragile condition. The surgeon worked with the precision of someone who had performed countless life-saving surgeries, yet this felt different. He couldn't afford to fail. The boy's life, his future, everything hinged on the next few moments. Sweat dripped from his brow, mixing with the sterile air of the room, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop, not until the boy was out of danger. Finally, the monitors began to show signs of stability. The boy's heart rate steadied, his breathing became more regular, and a sense of cautious relief filled the room. The nurses exchanged glances of quiet triumph, but the surgeon wasn't ready to celebrate. His eyes remained fixed on the boy, who was now being wheeled into intensive care. The battle wasn't over yet. The surgeon wiped his hands clean, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this night was far from finished. There were still too many unanswered questions. The surgeon stood in the hallway, watching the boy disappear into the intensive care unit. He felt a strange hollowness in his chest, a weight that wouldn't lift. This wasn't just another surgery. The boy's face, pale and still, haunted him. Why had he been lying there, alone in the rain? Who had hurt him? The questions buzzed in the surgeon's mind like static, but there were no answers yet. He had done his part for now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Stepping outside, The cool night air hit his face, mingling with the fading rain. The streets were still as empty as when he had first found the boy, but now they felt different, charged with a strange energy. He leaned against the hood of his car, letting the events of the night wash over him. The rain had stopped, but the tension in the air hadn't. The surgeon couldn't shake the feeling that finding this boy wasn't a coincidence. Something deeper was at play, and it felt as if his life was about to take a turn he never could have expected. As the surgeon got back into his car, his mind raced. The night wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had saved the boy's life, but the lingering unease told him that this was far from the end of the story. There was more to uncover, more to understand, and as he drove away from the hospital, he couldn't help but feel that this chance encounter, this unexpected twist of fate, was about to unravel in ways he could never have imagined. The road ahead, both literal and metaphorical, was filled with uncertainty. The hospital buzzed with urgency as the surgeon wheeled the child into the operating room, his face a mask of grim determination. There was no time for hesitation. The boy's condition had worsened during the frantic drive, his fragile body barely clinging to life. Every step echoed with the weight of responsibility as the surgeon moved quickly, giving orders to the nurses and preparing for what he knew would be a delicate, high-stakes operation. The room was tense, but his focus never wavered. This was a fight, and he had no intention of losing. As the bright surgical lights flooded the room, the boy's injuries came into full view, and the severity of his condition became all too clear. Cuts and deep bruises covered his small frame, a silent testimony to the trauma he had endured. The surgeon felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as he examined the wounds, his mind racing through possible scenarios. There were broken bones, internal bleeding. This was no accident. The boy had been through something horrific, but there was no time to dwell on that now. The priority was clear: save his life. The surgical team moved in sync, each step calculated, each movement precise. The surgeon's hands were steady, his mind locked into the rhythm of the procedure. He had performed countless surgeries like this, but tonight, every cut, every stitch felt more personal. The boy's life hung by a thread, and it was the surgeon's responsibility to pull him back from the brink. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he barely noticed. The world outside those sterile walls no longer existed. Only the boy, the injury, and the clock. Time became a blur as the hours stretched on, but the surgeon's concentration never faltered. He navigated the boy's fragile anatomy with the skill of a seasoned professional, but in his heart, he felt something deeper stirring. This wasn't just another patient. There was a connection, an invisible thread linking their fates. As the operation progressed, the weight of that realization pressed down on him. Each heartbeat, each breath from the boy was a fragile promise, and the surgeon was determined not to let it break. At one point, the boy's heart faltered, the monitor beeping wildly, sending a jolt of panic through the room. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The surgeon's hands, normally so sure, hesitated, but only for a moment. With quick, decisive action, he guided his team through the crisis, stabilizing the boy once again. The room breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the tension never fully lifted. The surgeon knew that the battle was far from over. Every second felt like an eternity, the stakes impossibly high. As the surgery continued, the surgeon's mind began to wander to darker places. Who had done this to the boy? What kind of violence had he endured to leave him in such a state? The injuries spoke volumes, but the answers were beyond his reach. He tried to push those thoughts aside, to focus on the delicate work in front of him. But the questions lingered, haunting the edges of his mind. No matter how skilled he was, no matter how much he had trained for moments like this, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the boy's vitals began to stabilize. The monitors hummed with a steady rhythm, signaling that the worst had passed. The surgeon allowed himself a moment of relief, though it was brief. He had managed to stop the bleeding, repair the internal damage, and mend the broken bones. But the real recovery would take time. The boy's body was still fragile, still vulnerable. The surgery had been a success, but the surgeon knew that the hardest part might still lie ahead. The boy was transferred to the intensive care unit, where he would be monitored around the clock. As the surgeon watched him being wheeled away, a sense of unease settled over him. He had done everything he could, yet something didn't feel right. The boy was stable, but for how long? What if his injuries were more than just physical? The surgeon's mind buzzed with thoughts of what would come next. The mystery of the boy's past, the violence that had brought him here. It was all still unresolved. Exhausted but unable to rest, the surgeon found himself pacing the hallway outside the ICU. The operation had taken everything out of him, but his mind refused to slow down. There were too many unknowns, too many loose threads. He couldn't stop thinking about how the boy had ended up on that sidewalk, alone and broken. The more he thought about it, the more the surgeon realized that this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning, and somehow, he was now a part of it. Standing in the dim hospital corridor, the surgeon knew his life had already been changed by this encounter. He had saved the boy's life, but the questions left in the wake of the surgery refused to let go. What had happened to this child? Why had fate brought him to that street, to that moment, to his hands? As he stared at the closed door of the ICU, the surgeon knew that the answers would come, but they would not come easily, and they would bring with them challenges he could never have expected. The drive home was quiet, with only the hum of the engine and the soft patter of rain against the windows. The surgeon, exhausted but relieved, allowed his mind to finally relax after the intense surgery. The boy was stable, and though the road ahead would be difficult, there was hope. For the first time that night, he felt a sense of accomplishment, a brief moment of peace. He entered his house, the familiar stillness of the empty rooms welcoming him. All he wanted now was to collapse into his chair and escape into something mindless. He grabbed the remote, sinking into his favorite chair, and turned on the TV. The local news flickered to life, filling the room with the voice of the anchor reporting the usual stories. But as his eyes began to droop, something on the screen caught his attention. The image of a child flashed across the screen, a boy. His breath caught in his throat as he sat up straight, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. The face on the screen was unmistakable. It was the boy he had just operated on, the one whose life he had fought to save. The report was devastating. The boy, it seemed, was no ordinary child. He was the son of a prominent public figure, and he had been missing for several days. His disappearance had sparked a massive search effort, with the authorities and media following every lead, every rumor. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. The boy had been abducted, and his life had been in grave danger. The words echoed in the surgeon's mind as he stared at the screen, trying to process what he was hearing. The boy he had saved was at the center of a nightmare. A wave of disbelief washed over him. The pieces started to fall into place, and the gravity of the situation hit him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just any child. This was the missing boy the whole city had been searching for, and now his life was still at risk. The surgeon felt a chill run down his spine. The boy's condition had been critical, but even with his medical intervention, the danger wasn't over. Who had done this? And more importantly, were they still out there, looking for him? As the report continued, more details came to light. The boy had been taken from his family under mysterious circumstances, and his captors had yet to be identified. The authorities were urging anyone with information to come forward, and the media was buzzing with speculation. But as the surgeon listened, a new fear crept into his mind. He had saved the boy, but had he done enough? Was the hospital secure enough to keep him safe? The idea that the people responsible for this could still be out there, looking for the boy, made his stomach churn. The surgeon's exhaustion was forgotten as his mind raced through the possibilities. Had the kidnappers followed the boy to the hospital? Could they be watching, waiting for another opportunity? He stood up from his chair, pacing the room as the news continued to play in the background. His pulse quickened, and a knot of anxiety twisted in his chest. He had done his job as a surgeon, but now he felt a responsibility that went far beyond the operating room. He needed to make sure the boy was truly safe. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing. It was a colleague from the hospital, calling to check in on the boy's condition. The surgeon's hand trembled slightly as he answered, his voice thick with the weight of what he had just learned. He relayed the information calmly, professionally, but inside, his mind was spinning. The conversation was brief, but it left him feeling more unsettled than before. The hospital knew who the boy was now, and so did the world. But did the people who had taken him know where he was? Sitting back down, the surgeon stared at the television, the boy's face still haunting him from the screen. The news anchor spoke of hope, of the relief the family must feel knowing their son was alive. But all the surgeon could think about was the danger that still lurked. The boy was safe for now, but how long would that last? His mind raced with questions, none of them with easy answers. He had saved the boy's life, but what if the kidnappers came for him again? The thought was unbearable. The night dragged on, and the news cycle continued, repeating the same story, showing the same image of the boy over and over again. The surgeon couldn't tear his eyes away. Each time the boy's face appeared, the knot in his stomach tightened. He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just as the surgeon who had saved him, but as the person who had found him. Was it fate that had brought them together, or something more sinister? The questions swirled in his mind, refusing to settle. As the hours passed, the weight of the night pressed down on him. He couldn't escape the feeling that this wasn't over, that the boy's life was still hanging in the balance. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He couldn't just sit by and watch. He had to do something. The surgeon knew that he was no detective, no hero, but he also knew that he had a part to play in this story. And whatever it was, he wasn't going to let the boy slip away again. Not after everything they had been through. He stood up, his decision made. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many risks that hadn't been accounted for. He couldn't leave this to chance. His instincts as a doctor told him that the boy needed protection, and his heart told him that this was far from over. As he reached for his phone to make a call, the rain outside began to fall harder, as if the night itself was urging him forward. This wasn't just a matter of life and death anymore. This was a fight to keep the boy safe, and it was only just beginning. The surgeon sat in the stillness of his living room, his mind racing despite the quiet surrounding him. The boy's face from the news broadcast lingered in his thoughts, a haunting reminder of the danger that might still be looming. He had done everything he could to save the child physically, but now a new weight pressed down on him. Fear. Fear for the boy's safety, fear of what might happen next. He couldn't shake the thought that someone, somewhere, might still be searching for him. The hospital, while secure, suddenly felt vulnerable. As the night stretched on, doubts began to creep in, eating away at his initial relief. Had he done the right thing by rushing the boy to the hospital without notifying the authorities first? Should he have alerted the police immediately when he realized the boy's injuries were no accident? The surgeon's chest tightened with the realization that, in his haste to save the boy's life, he might have missed a crucial step. The boy was safe for now, but the shadow of what he had learned from the news loomed large in his mind. He picked up his phone, tempted to call the hospital, to make sure the boy was still secure, but hesitated. What would he even say? Could he truly protect the boy from forces beyond his control? The surgeon wasn't accustomed to feeling helpless. His life had been defined by his ability to act, to take control of situations that teetered on the edge of chaos. But this was different. This wasn't a problem he could fix with sutures or steady hands. It was a threat that existed outside the walls of the operating room, and it terrified him. The minutes passed like hours, each one weighed down by the growing tension in his chest. He turned the situation over and over in his mind, trying to find some clarity, some way to ensure the boy's safety. But every answer seemed to lead to more questions, and every decision felt fraught with risk. Should he contact the family himself? Would that make things worse? He had done everything within his power to save the boy's life. Yet now it felt like his responsibility was far from over. The weight of it threatened to overwhelm him. A deep sense of unease settled over him as he watched the news replay the boy's story again. Each time, the details became more chilling. The child had been taken in the dead of night, his family left with no clues, no hope until now. And while the world outside the hospital rejoiced at the boy's survival, the surgeon couldn't shake the feeling that something was still terribly wrong. His hands, so steady in the operating room, now trembled slightly as he thought about what might happen next. The surgeon's thoughts drifted to the boy's family. They must be frantic, desperate for answers, hoping for some sign that their son was safe. And yet, despite everything, the surgeon hadn't contacted them. A pang of guilt hit him. He knew he should have acted sooner, but fear had kept him silent. He feared that bringing attention to the boy's presence at the hospital would only invite more danger. The kidnappers were still out there, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't rest until they found him. As he stared at the phone in his hand, the weight of the decision became unbearable. What if the boy's life was still in danger, and his silence was only making things worse? But at the same time, exposing the boy's location could be a death sentence. The surgeon's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to balance the risk. He had always been the type of person who acted decisively, but now, every choice felt like it carried the weight of the world. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. The night dragged on, and sleep became impossible. The surgeon found himself pacing the floor, his mind replaying every moment of the night he found the boy. He thought of the rain, the broken body on the sidewalk, and the split-second decision to take him to the hospital. It had felt like the right thing to do in the moment, but now he wasn't so sure. Doubt gnawed at him, and with it, a growing fear that he had missed something crucial. The surgeon was trained to deal with life-and-death situations, but this was different. This was personal. He stopped pacing, staring out the window at the dark, rain-soaked street below. The city was quiet, but his thoughts were anything but. He couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's survival had set something in motion, something bigger than either of them. The surgeon had saved his life, but now he wondered if he had the strength to protect it. His thoughts raced back to the hospital, where the boy lay unconscious, unaware of the storm gathering around him. The surgeon felt powerless, and he hated it. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the window, the surgeon knew he had to act. He couldn't sit in silence any longer, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. The boy's life depended on more than just medical care now. It depended on his ability to face the unknown, to make the hard choices that lay ahead. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the difficult decisions to come. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, he would face it head-on. But even as he made his choice, the sense of impending danger still lingered, unresolved. The surgeon found himself standing at a crossroads, the weight of his next decision pressing down on him like never before. The boy lay in the hospital, vulnerable and unaware of the chaos surrounding his life. The surgeon's instincts told him to act, but the path forward was unclear. Should he notify the authorities immediately, or would that risk drawing more unwanted attention? The kidnappers were still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. The hospital was secure, but no place was truly safe if someone was determined enough to breach it. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that every choice he made carried unimaginable consequences. If he went to the police, the boy's identity would be exposed, and that could make him a target once more. But if he kept quiet, there was the risk that those responsible for the kidnapping could slip through the cracks, or worse, strike again. The surgeon's hands, so steady during surgery, now trembled with the weight of this impossible decision. He felt as if he were operating in the dark, uncertain of the outcome no matter which way he turned. The phone in his hand seemed to burn with the weight of his next call. The boy's family needed to know he was alive, that he was in the hospital, but at what cost? The surgeon knew that making that call would open the floodgates, drawing media attention and possibly alerting the kidnappers to the boy's whereabouts. Could he protect the child if the situation spiraled out of control? His heart raced as he weighed the options, each one leading to a different kind of risk. There was no easy answer, only the knowledge that time was running out. In the stillness of the hospital corridors, the surgeon walked slowly, his mind racing. He had seen the aftermath of violence before, but this was different. This child wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was the center of a dark, unfolding story that the surgeon had unwittingly become part of. Every step he took seemed heavier, burdened by the enormity of the decision he faced. Should he take matters into his own hands, or should he trust the system to protect the boy? The stakes had never felt higher. A part of him wanted to shield the boy from the world, to keep him hidden in the anonymity of the hospital. But he knew that wasn't a long-term solution. The family was desperate to find their son, and the longer he kept them in the dark, the more complicated things would become. Still, the fear that the kidnappers might already be closing in gnawed at him. What if his call tipped them off? What if the boy's life was in even greater danger because of his actions? The surgeon felt trapped in a web of uncertainty. The pressure of the media only added to the complexity. The world was watching, waiting for any scrap of news about the missing child. If word got out that the boy had been found, the hospital would become a target, not just for the kidnappers, but for the press, the public, everyone with an interest in the story. The surgeon felt as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, one misstep away from disaster. He had to be careful, but there was no guide for how to navigate this kind of situation. As he watched the boy sleep in the ICU, surrounded by monitors and machines, the surgeon's heart ached with the weight of his responsibility. This wasn't just about saving a life anymore. It was about protecting that life from forces far beyond the surgeon's control. The boy's fate seemed intertwined with his own now, and the surgeon knew that whatever he decided, it would change everything. His thoughts raced as he considered every angle, every possible outcome. But the answers eluded him. The nurses moved quietly around the boy's bed, their focus on the medical details, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. The surgeon envied their ability to focus solely on the task at hand, while he was left grappling with decisions that went far beyond medicine. He wished, for a moment, that he could hand the responsibility over to someone else, but he knew that wasn't an option. The boy was in his care, and that meant every decision, every action, rested on his shoulders. The weight of it felt unbearable. Finally, the surgeon made up his mind. He would contact the authorities, but only after taking precautions to ensure the boy's safety within the hospital. The child's identity would remain a closely guarded secret for as long as possible, and he would work with the security team to make sure no one could get close to him without proper clearance. It was a delicate balance, keeping the boy safe while alerting the necessary people to his existence. The surgeon felt a flicker of resolve. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best he could do under the circumstances. As he prepared to make the call, the tension in his chest eased slightly, though the uncertainty still lingered. This decision was only the beginning. The boy's life was far from safe, and the surgeon knew that the real danger might still be lurking in the shadows. But for now, he had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. As the phone rang in his hand, the surgeon braced himself for what was to come, knowing that the story was far from over, and that the real battle had only just begun. With a heavy heart, the surgeon finally dialed the number that would change everything. The family had been waiting, desperate for any news about their missing son. As the phone rang, his chest tightened, knowing that this moment would bring both relief and new complications. When the voice on the other end answered, trembling with hope and fear, the surgeon's words caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of their expectation, and the silence that followed his introduction was almost unbearable. Then, he spoke. The boy was alive, safe for now. The relief on the other end was palpable, a sob breaking through the quiet before the flood of questions began. The family wanted to know everything: how he was, where he was, and most importantly, when they could see him. But the surgeon, calm despite the whirlwind of emotion, explained that while the boy was out of immediate danger, there were still risks. His voice remained steady as he outlined the situation, warning them that the hospital was on high alert due to the circumstances surrounding their son's kidnapping. When the family arrived at the hospital, the tension in the air was electric. They rushed into the ICU, their eyes scanning the room for the small figure they had been praying for. The surgeon stood nearby, watching as they embraced their son, tears of relief flowing freely. It was a moment filled with emotion, joy, sorrow, fear. But amidst it all, there was a sense of hope. The boy was alive, and for the first time in days, the family could breathe. But even as they wept, the surgeon knew this reunion was only the beginning of a new set of challenges. The conversation shifted to the looming threat that still hung over them all. The kidnappers were still at large, and no one knew what lengths they would go to in order to retrieve the boy. The surgeon spoke frankly, outlining the security measures in place, but the fear in the parents' eyes told him that reassurance was a luxury they couldn't afford. They were grateful to him for saving their son, But the question that lingered was whether they could keep him safe in the days ahead. The air in the room grew heavy with uncertainty. As the family sat by the boy's bedside, their joy tempered by fear, the surgeon couldn't help but feel a deep connection to them. He had been part of the boy's journey from the moment he found him on the street, and now, as they faced the unknown together, he felt responsible for more than just the boy's health. The burden of keeping him safe weighed heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time, the surgeon realized how deeply intertwined his life had become with theirs. He was no longer just a doctor. He was part of their story. The family expressed their gratitude through tears, their voices thick with emotion. They thanked the surgeon again and again, but he couldn't bring himself to feel relief. The danger was still very real, and he knew that the hardest part was yet to come. As the family shared a quiet moment with their son, the surgeon excused himself, stepping out into the hallway. He needed a moment to collect his thoughts, to prepare for the battles that lay ahead. This was far from over, and he knew the kidnappers wouldn't rest until they had what they wanted. Standing alone in the dimly lit corridor, the surgeon's thoughts were racing. The family was reunited, but what came next? The media was already circling, hungry for a story, and the kidnappers could strike at any moment. The surgeon felt a deep sense of unease settle over him. He had done everything he could to protect the boy medically, but now, the threat went beyond his control. He could no longer rely on his skills in the operating room to solve this problem. It was a sobering realization, one that left him feeling vulnerable in a way he hadn't anticipated. As he re-entered the ICU, the sight of the family huddled together around the boy stirred something deep within him. They were safe for now, but how long could that last? The tension in the room was palpable, a silent reminder that the danger hadn't passed. The surgeon knew that the authorities were working to track down the kidnappers, but until they were caught, no one could truly relax. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound a potential danger. The air in the hospital was thick with fear. Despite the momentary relief of the boy's survival, the surgeon took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had been trained to handle crises, to make life-and-death decisions under pressure, but this was different. The stakes were higher, and the enemies were unseen, lurking in the background. He exchanged a look with the boy's father, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they both understood. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and as the night wore on, the surgeon knew that every decision from here on out would be critical to ensuring the boy's survival. The reunion had brought a moment of respite, but the surgeon knew it wouldn't last. The kidnappers were still out there, and the hospital had become a battleground for forces beyond his control. He stood by the door, watching the family, feeling the weight of their trust pressing down on him. They looked to him for answers, for protection, but he had none to give. All he could do was prepare for the next phase of this nightmare, hoping that somehow they would all make it through unscathed. But deep down, he feared the worst was yet to come. The next few days at the hospital were a whirlwind of heightened security and whispered conversations. The boy's room was placed under strict surveillance, with guards stationed outside the ICU door at all hours. No one could enter without clearance, and every visitor was thoroughly checked. The atmosphere was tense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The surgeon moved through the halls with a sense of quiet determination, knowing that while the immediate threat had been addressed, the danger still loomed. The boy's recovery, though slow, was steady. His frail body, once so close to the brink, began to show signs of healing. But the psychological toll was still unknown. The surgeon, watching from a distance, knew that the wounds visible on the outside were only part of the story. Inside, the boy had experienced unimaginable trauma, and no amount of medical treatment could heal that completely. He found himself lingering outside the room more often than he intended, his mind restless with thoughts of the boy's future. Meanwhile, the hospital had become a fortress. The authorities worked around the clock, coordinating with the hospital staff to ensure that the boy was protected at all costs. Every visitor was a potential threat, every shadow a possible danger. The surgeon had never seen security measures like these, but they were necessary. The kidnappers were still out there, and no one knew when, or if, they would strike again. The tension in the air was thick, and even the smallest noise could send the staff into a state of high alert. For the surgeon, the days felt long and exhausting, not from physical labor, but from the emotional strain of knowing the boy was still a target. Every time he walked past the ICU, he couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep him safe. The boy's parents visited often, their faces a mix of relief and fear. They thanked the surgeon every time they saw him, but their gratitude only deepened his sense of responsibility. He had saved the boy once, but could he protect him from the threats that lay ahead? One night, as the hospital quieted down and the city outside slept, the surgeon found himself staring out the window, the lights of the streets below flickering in the distance. He had done everything he could medically, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's safety hung by a thread. The thought of the kidnappers still out there, watching, waiting for their chance, made the surgeon's skin crawl. He knew that despite the security, the boy was not yet free from danger. And the longer the kidnappers were on the loose, the more desperate they might become. The authorities assured the surgeon and the boy's family that they were doing everything in their power to catch those responsible. Investigations were underway, leads were being followed, but no one knew how long it would take. The surgeon tried to find solace in the fact that the boy was at least physically safe for the time being, but the fear of the unknown gnawed at him. Every passing hour felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation, and the surgeon couldn't help but wonder if they were prepared for what was to come. As the days turned into a week, the hospital began to feel like a prison, not just for the boy, but for everyone involved. The surgeon's every thought was consumed by the situation. He had dedicated his life to saving people in the operating room, but now, outside of it, he felt powerless. He had no control over the manhunt, no influence over the threats that lurked beyond the hospital's walls. It was a feeling he wasn't used to, this helplessness in the face of something he couldn't fix with his hands or his medical knowledge. Then, late one evening, news came that the authorities had finally tracked down the people responsible for the kidnapping. It was a small victory, but it brought a wave of relief that swept through the hospital. The boy's family was informed immediately, and for the first time in days, there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes. The surgeon watched from afar as they embraced, their fears slowly melting away, replaced by a cautious optimism. The nightmare was not over, but at least now, they could see a path forward. With the immediate threat neutralized, the boy's safety was more assured. The hospital, while still maintaining heightened security, began to relax its restrictions slightly. The surgeon, too, felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though he knew that the emotional scars from this ordeal would take much longer to heal. As he walked past the boy's room, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing that for now, the child was safe. But in his heart, he understood that the world outside was still unpredictable, and anything could happen. As the boy continued to heal, both physically and emotionally, the surgeon found himself reflecting on the fragility of life. This experience had reminded him that while he could mend broken bodies, there were forces beyond his control, forces that required not just skill, but courage and resilience. And as he stood in the quiet halls of the hospital, he realized that this ordeal had changed him too. He had saved the boy's life once, but in doing so, he had been reminded of the delicate balance between life and danger, and how, in the end, they were all just trying to keep that balance from tipping. As the days passed and the hospital began to return to its usual rhythm, the surgeon found himself reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The boy's recovery had been a slow but steady process, and though his body was healing, the emotional scars would take far longer to mend. The surgeon, too, carried his own scars, ones that weren't visible but had left a profound mark on his heart. This experience had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had saved countless lives in his career, but this time had been different. This time, it felt personal. The bond that had formed between the surgeon and the boy's family was one forged in the crucible of fear and uncertainty. They had come to trust him not just as a doctor but as a protector, someone who had stood by them through their darkest hours. And though the immediate threat had passed, the surgeon knew that their relationship would endure. Every time he visited the boy in the ICU, the parents would look at him with a mixture of gratitude and awe, as if he had done something beyond the realm of medicine. What lingered most in the surgeon's mind, however, was the feeling of fate's hand in all of this. If he hadn't been driving down that deserted street on that rainy night, the boy might never have been found. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. How many other moments in life hinged on such seemingly random encounters? How many other lives had been saved or lost by the sheer chance of being in the right place at the right time? These questions had no easy answers, but they weighed heavily on him as he reflected on the fragility of life. The boy's story had become part of him, woven into the fabric of his identity as a surgeon. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay detached, to focus on the task at hand without letting emotion cloud his judgment. But this time, he had been unable to maintain that distance. Something about the boy, about the entire situation, had struck a deep chord within him. Perhaps it was the innocence of the child, or the brutality of the circumstances that had led him to that rainy sidewalk. Whatever it was, the surgeon knew he would never forget this case. As the weeks went on, the surgeon found himself thinking more and more about the nature of his work. He had dedicated his life to saving people in the operating room, but this experience had shown him that life didn't always fit neatly within the boundaries of medicine. There were threats beyond the physical, forces of violence, cruelty, and fate that could rip people apart in ways that no scalpel or stitch could mend. It was a humbling realization, one that left the surgeon feeling both small and deeply connected to the world around him. The boy's family continued to visit, even as his condition improved. They often brought small gifts for the surgeon, tokens of their gratitude that felt far too grand for what he had done. But each time they came, he felt the weight of their appreciation, and it reminded him that his role in their lives had extended far beyond that of a doctor. He had become part of their story, just as they had become part of his. And though their visits would eventually become less frequent as the boy fully recovered, the surgeon knew their connection would never truly fade. The surgeon often found himself replaying the events of that night in his mind. The rain, the boy on the sidewalk, the frantic drive to the hospital. He wondered how differently things might have turned out if just one detail had been different. If he had taken a different route home, if the rain had been heavier, if the boy had been found by someone else. The fragility of those moments haunted him, reminding him that life was often a series of small, seemingly insignificant decisions that could change everything. Even as the boy's health improved, the surgeon couldn't shake the feeling that this experience had taught him something invaluable. He had always been a skilled surgeon, but this ordeal had reminded him of the importance of compassion, of the human connection that lies at the heart of medicine. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about understanding the lives you were saving, about recognizing the deeper forces at play in the world. And for the first time in a long while, the surgeon felt truly humbled by the power of his profession. As the boy prepared to leave the hospital, the surgeon stood by his side, watching as the family gathered their things, preparing for the journey home. The boy looked up at him with wide eyes, still too young to fully grasp the magnitude of what had happened. But in that moment, the surgeon felt a profound sense of closure. He had done what he could, and now the boy's future lay in the hands of fate once again. The surgeon smiled softly, offering the boy a final word of encouragement before watching him walk out of the hospital, hand in hand with his parents. In the quiet that followed, the surgeon allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had been a part of something extraordinary, something that had tested him not just as a doctor, but as a human being. And though the boy's story had come to an end within the walls of the hospital, its impact would stay with him forever. Life, he realized, was full of unexpected encounters and hidden dangers. But in the midst of it all, there were moments of grace, moments where the power of compassion and courage could change everything. And for that, the surgeon was eternally grateful. Before you go, there's another story waiting for you. A story filled with even more twists, surprises, and heart-stopping moments. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Just when you think you've figured it out, everything changes. Go ahead, click on that next video, and prepare to be captivated all over again. And hey, while you're at it, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll be the first to know when the next thrilling story drops. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Let us know what you thought about this one in the comments below.